I'm going to quickly introduce the gentleman seated with me, and then we'll listen to the presentations on the two papers. Seated right next to me is Bob Hughes, who we are lucky enough to have in transition as he moves from being president of New Visions for Public School in New York to become the director of K-12 strategy at the Gates Foundation this June. Russ Whitehurst, who's a senior fellow at the Center on Children and Families at the Brookings Institution. John Manzi, who's the founder of Foundry DC and the author of Uncontrolled, the surprising payoff of trial and error for business, policy, and society. We have our author, who's also going to present the paper, Jonathan Gurian, who the paper is called Improving Academic Outcomes for Disadvantaged Students, Scaling Up Individualized Tutorials. Jonathan is an associate professor of human development and social policy and of economics at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. And then we have two co-authors. One is joining the panel, is Benjamin Jones. Aaron Chatterjee is the other co-author. Aaron will be presenting the paper. The paper is entitled Learning What Works in Educational Technology with a Case Study of EduStar. Ben is a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern University. And Aaron, who will be presenting in the future, is an associate professor of business and public policy at Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. So, Jonathan, I'm going to invite you up to the panel, up to the podium, excuse me.
Okay, so this is joint work with Rosanna Ander, who's here, and Jens Ludwig, who's a colleague at the University of Chicago. So I want to start with some math problems. So these are two math problems that are in the curriculum for 9th and 10th grade in the Chicago Public Schools. And these are three math problems that I have witnessed 9th and 10th graders in the Chicago Public Schools not be able to do. So now imagine that you are in a 9th or 10th grade math class in the Chicago Public Schools or any school, and you can't do these. You don't know how to multiply 7 times 4. And the teacher is spending the class teaching this. Okay, that was an incredibly frustrating experience. I know if I were in that situation, eventually I would just stop listening. Now think of it from the perspective of the teacher. The teacher is sitting there in a classroom of 30 to 35 kids, and there's a huge amount of variation. It's not that every kid can't do that. Some kids can do the other problem fine, but there's a wide amount of variation in what kids know and what kids don't know. And being a teacher in a room where there's that much variation makes teaching very, very difficult. And schools are just not set up very well to deal with variation in the level of kids' prior knowledge and the rate at which they learn it. If you sort of think of how schools are organized, we have classrooms and grades. And both of them deal really well with where everyone's about the same. Classrooms, you have a bunch of kids all in the same room being taught by one person. Grades, everybody moves up year by year. And so what we're going to propose is a possible solution to that problem. So if you sort of think that the problem is that there's this mismatch between what kids already know and the way that instruction is delivered to them, then, and if a lot of that has to do with the amount of variation in both the level of kids' prior knowledge and the rate at which they learn, or are learning, then the solution has to be both individualized and very intensive. Individualized because kids are at different points in their knowledge, and intensive because many kids are very far behind grade level. And so the goal of a solution to this would be to help the kids who are really far behind grade level, 3, 4, 5 grades behind, get back up to grade level so that a system based on classrooms and grades can be more effective, and so that classroom teachers can more effectively do their job. So our proposed solution to this is an individualized math tutorial program that was designed by Match Education, a charter school in Boston, and now delivered by Saga Innovations. Alan Saffron and Barbara Allegren are here if you guys have questions for them. They're from Saga. It is a math tutorial program with 2-on-1 instruction. So the way that it works is it happens in school for one class period per day, every day. It is a regular class. Kids get credit for it. It's in their schedule. If you walk into a classroom, there's about, say, 11 or 12 tutors and 2 kids per tutor. And each tutor is at a different table with the 2 kids paired with them. And the tutors tutor the kids in math and start where they are. So if a kid doesn't understand how to multiply 2-digit numbers, the tutors will work with them at that level and work on at the rate that the kids can learn. And as fast as the kids can make progress, they will move ahead as the kids progress. Now, we tested this in a randomized controlled trial study over a few years. I'll show you the results from a study that we did a couple of years ago, where Saga Innovations came into the Chicago Public Schools. We did a randomized controlled trial, which means that we chose a group of kids who were eligible for the program. We randomly selected some of them to be offered the program, offered the chance to participate, and others not to be, based on basically a flip of a coin. And what we found is that the kids who were randomly selected to be offered the chance to participate in this math tutorial program had a very significant increase in their math test scores. So over the course of 1 year, the kids who participated in the program improved their standardized math test scores of a magnitude that is about 1/3 the size of the black-white test score gap. Another way to think about it is that they learned about 1 to 2 additional years of math above and beyond what the kids in the control group are learning in a year, just in the course of that 1 year. Another way to think about it is they went from about the 34th percentile nationally to the 42nd percentile nationally, so they closed about half the gap between them on average and the average kid in the nation just in 1 year. The kids were not just doing better on standardized math test scores, they also were less likely to fail their regular math class outside of the tutorials. So their math teacher was noticing whatever they were learning in the math tutorial was carrying over to the regular math classes. They were about 50% less likely to fail their math class, and their grade point average increased significantly. They didn't just improve in their math courses, they also were about 28% less likely to fail their non-math courses. Okay, so the kids are doing better in math, they are becoming better students, and that's carrying over not just into the math classes, but into their other classes. So what we're proposing is that all schools that receive Title I funding would set up a system where every 3rd through 10th grade student who is at least 2 grade levels behind in math would offer this type of intensive math tutorial, a 2-on-1 ratio that would happen in school every day for the whole year. We talked a lot earlier about Title I and the flexibility that Title I offers. This is something that could be funded with Title I money that schools already get. Chicago, who we worked with, was able actually to get a waiver under the old system to use Title I funds to do it, but now with the new system and Nora's expert guidance, we all know that we don't even need a waiver. There's money to do this. And the goal is, again, to get kids back to grade level and to solve that problem of having kids with, who are at a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade level all in the same room, which makes it very, very difficult for a classroom teacher. I know myself, and I teach economics classes at a very selective university, Northwestern, where we have a very, very intensive selection system just to make sure that there's no variation in how much educational background kids have when they get there. It still is really difficult to teach kids because they have variation. And in a world where there were many, many more students in the room and there's much more variation, it would be very difficult. So our view is that this is something that could be very complementary to the job that classroom teachers do and can help make their jobs easier and help them be more effective and spend more time on instruction and be able to deliver what kids actually need to succeed.
Thank you, Jonathan. I believe Aaron.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be able to share our work here at Brookings at the Hamilton Project. So this is joint work with Ben Jones, who will represent us on the panel, and it's about learning what works, the case study of EduStar. Jonathan started off with a great math problem. I teach in a business school, so I'll start off with a picture. So this is a picture of my local public school in Durham, North Carolina, and it's a 21st century classroom. Probably looks a lot like the classroom that your kids go to. But the problem here is what's missing from this picture. And in almost every classroom in the United States, what's missing is knowledge of what actually works. We have lots of content being streamed to our students. They're engaged with it during classroom time, but we have no idea what actually improves student learning. And you might know, well, there's a lot of choices out there. So on the left, you can see the proliferation of apps and digital learning activities and tools to help students learn. But on the right, you see the reality, which is without knowing what works, we're drowning in a sea of apps. If you don't know what content works for the right student at the right time, more choice isn't necessarily a good thing. And so when Ben and I started to look at this, we said, we really can't unlock the potential of educational technology unless we know what works. And in the current system, students and teachers are being poorly served. They're not getting the best available content. Why? Simply because we don't know what the best possible content is. Nobody's doing the evaluation. At the same time, think about the other side, the entrepreneurs and innovators, many of them teachers, by the way, who are creating new digital learning tools. There's no incentive to create great products if there's no benchmark. There's no way to show that yours works better than something else that's already on the market. It's a huge problem in the innovation system. And so when you put that all together, we're not likely to get the outcomes that we want and we hope for unless we change that. Now, this might seem like a very technical point, something that sort of a data scientist at Google would care about. But for Ben and I as parents and people who work in education, it's actually a huge deal. It can be a game changer in education. But even if you're with me to this point, you'll recognize a very simple fact: rigorous evaluation, incredibly time-consuming and very expensive. So what Ben and I set out to do is figure out how can we build a low-cost platform to rigorously evaluate educational technology. And that's what EduStar is all about. And we could use that evidence to actually put the right content in front of the right student at the right time. And one of the great things that we owe a lot to the Hamilton Project for is that this idea started here in 2012. We proposed this idea on a Hamilton Project panel. At the time, it was kind of a high-level abstract idea that we were really excited about. What we were lacking was skilled K-12 educators and operators who could actually make this reality. So Power My Learning, which is represented here today by Elizabeth Stock, Mark Malaspina, and Usham Khan, who are in the audience here today, they took over the implementation in 2013. And since then, they've done 77 product evaluations of educational technology. Here's what EduStar does. It's a platform for doing randomized controlled trials on digital learning activities. We compare head-to-head and also against a control group and can figure out what works and what doesn't. We're built on the Power My Learning Connect platform. So I'll just tell you a little bit about that. Power My Learning Connect already has 40 partner schools and 8 million page views per month. One really important thing is when you build on an existing platform, all the incentive conflicts that usually come about when you're trying to do evaluations, a lot of those become easier because now you're actually building on a platform that people are already coming to use because it's good. So we've built on Power My Learning Connect over the last couple of years to do these evaluations. Now, what do? So we do what Google and Amazon do every day when they do something called A/B testing. We take, for example, 3 groups of students. They all take the same pre-questions that are based on the Common Core assessments. Then the first 2 groups of students will interact with a digital learning activity, maybe something to teach them how to divide fractions, which we'll talk about in a second. The third group, which you'll call the control group, goes directly to a post-assessment. Of course, we've designed it so they eventually get the digital learning activity. It would be unfair, and it frankly would not work in a classroom if everyone didn't get access to the same material. So looking at these 3 groups, we can do some really powerful things. If we run this enough times, we can tell you whether the growth in terms of the pre and post assessment means that DLA 1, digital activity 1, is better than digital activity 2, and whether they're better than doing nothing at all. That kind of evidence can be a game changer. Remember, we don't have anything like this. So when your school district recommends a list of recommended apps that your students should learn, that's not coming from any engine that looks like this. It's coming from a variety of different sources that we could talk about during the Q&A. So let me give you 2 quick examples just to let you know how these things work. And we'll start with the dividing fractions. So it's a Common Core standard, and we can link these to Common Core standards or any other kinds of assessments that you like. We've used the Common Core because of their use across the states. So there's one really boring digital learning activity called dividing fractions. It does exactly what it says it does, which is teach you how to divide fractions, we think. There's another one that I would find much more exciting, I think, which is called basketball dividing fractions. Which one do you guys think actually does better in teaching students how to divide fractions? Any ideas? Number one, number two? Two. People think two, maybe because it has more engagement. Hold that thought for a second. Let me show you one other one. We also have two versions of the same product. So a company called LearnZillion produced two different versions of the same product. It's also useful for that too, because you can figure out which version actually works better. In the first version, you have a baseline video that teaches you a fundamental math skill. You watch the video, you learn something about that math skill. The second version of this LearnZillion product is the same baseline video with one wrinkle. And that wrinkle is they give you a tutorial of common mistakes that one would make doing this skill. Now, I'm a testament to the power of being reminded of my common mistakes, mostly by my wife. But in the end of the day, is this actually going to help students learn? So what do people think? Pedagogically, do you think it's going to work better when we tell students the common mistakes they have, let's say dividing fractions, or just the baseline video? So some differences. I heard someone say common mistakes, someone say baseline videos. So let's see what the results. We can run these rapidly on EduStar. So let's go back to the boring dividing fractions versus basketball dividing fractions. Turns out boring is better. Dividing fractions outperforms basketball dividing fractions. And our basketball players, and this is the remarkable part about it, they spend 5 more minutes playing the basketball game than our students on the dividing fractions, which means they're spending more time and getting less learning. Now, if I was looking over my kid's shoulder at what app they were using, I would think that that was engagement. It turns out that that's actually not good performance. On the second one, we look at the video tutorials. Good news for LearnZillion is that both video tutorials do better than doing nothing at all. Now, that might seem like a very modest benchmark, but I can tell you, doing better than nothing at all is actually a really important ed tech goal. It's not clear at all that the things we put in front of our kids are actually helping them learn better than doing nothing at all. We don't know that. Now, comparing the video tutorials to the ones with the common mistakes, somebody guessed it, I think, up here, common mistakes does worse. We don't know why yet. That's an interesting opportunity for learning scientists. Why would showing someone the common mistake they make and going through a math problem actually make them do worse? Is it robust to other kinds of math skills? These are the kinds of things you can figure out with this sort of platform. It's just sort of the beginning. So what do we learn from all this? First, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the role of the teachers in the 40 partner schools. I mean, for Ben and I, sort of getting the feedback through Elizabeth and her team about what teachers think about how this works is incredibly important. The control group design that you just saw, that was obvious to many of you who've worked in a school, we didn't know that before. Of course, the students have to have access to the same content. It wouldn't work if some students never got the content. You can't imagine your kid coming home and saying, I didn't learn anything today, I was in the control group. Right? So we have to do that. And that's really helped us align EduStar with the goals of classrooms. Now, the platform can also be useful to multiple groups. So first, students, teachers, parents, they're really interested in the consumer reports function, the idea of knowing what works and why. But content developers, like those who make the videos, that make the digital learning activities, this is the first time they've had information to do the kind of A/B testing that's so important in entrepreneurship. And finally, the education researchers who can go and learn about things like common mistakes and why those might not be pedagogically important. So we have a couple guiding principles that I'll just finish on here. Evaluation, in our estimation, based on this experience, has to be rigorous, continuous, and also conducted by a trusted advisor, a third party often, and preferably built on an existing platform. The reason is you don't want to have to draw people to a platform to do your evaluation. You want a successful platform that you can kind of do the tests without disrupting the workflow. And that's really, really hard to do, but we think we have it with our Power My Learning team that's managing this. In the end, just to give you a sense of what next, we think at scale that this can be a game changer in educational technology. We can figure out, using these tests, what the right content is for the right student at the right time, and hopefully it can be a contributor to raising outcomes in education. I'll let Ben take the questions on the panel, and thanks for listening.
From a pedagogical point of view, I'm going to start with a question for Bob and pull us back to the tutorial.
Okay.
So that we can all. You've had a lot of experience with tutoring. And how does Jonathan's proposal, how does this idea of one-on-two tutoring conform with your experiences, and what new elements does it bring to the discussion?
Well, I would say tutoring isn't a new concept, and I think you see it across the board. What I liked about the presentation and it was the overall process that you engaged in. And when you kind of take one step back, you had a school that was trying to kind of do better by its kids. It tested a series of different experiments with those kids, You picked up on one that looked particularly promising and then did a randomized control trial on that to determine whether or not it was suitable as a change package to go much broader. I think, building on some of the stuff Tony said, we're so often in search of a problem with a solution that we've manufactured. I think that this process is very valuable. And I think across the country, there's an enormous amount of innovation going on in classrooms all the time. And I think what we have to start to do ties to the second paper, really starting to build an infrastructure that enables us to evaluate what educators are doing and make some judgments about those issues or strategies or tools that we want to scale. You can build a platform to do that. You can do what you did, which was set up an experiment. You can actually use the limitations of government funding to create spontaneous randomized controlled trials. But I think it's really important that we do that, but we always do it in the context of this broader creation process that educators are regularly involved in. And then I just had one technical question, and I don't know if we're allowed to.
Please.
The math that the kids were doing, was it algebra? And do you think that the tutorial laid a basis ultimately for more complex math that's envisioned by the Common Core? Because in our experience anyway, in math tutorials, the algebra is something you can do relatively simply. Once you get to algebraic thinking and beyond to trigonometry and some of the other issues, it's tough.
This is a great question. I'm going to answer, but if Alan and Barbara if I get this wrong, you guys can correct me. But and actually, the answer has changed a little bit year to year because we've continued to study this SAGA tutoring program, and over the course of the time we've continued to study, the Common Core has become implemented. But the basic way to think about it is that during the 50 to 55 minute period, there's some mix of time spent doing what you can think of as basic skills, which is meeting kids at where they are, which will vary kid to kid, and then doing translation or working on the stuff that the kids are doing in their regular math class, because this is in addition to the regular math class. So the tutors and the site directors who are running what's going on in the tutors at that particular school are coordinating with the math teachers and the department chair of the math program to pay attention to what's going on in each kid's classroom. And so it'll be a mix. As they move to the Common Core, the curriculum there's a whole curriculum that the tutors follow. The curriculum was shifted more towards being tethered to what's going on in the classroom around the Common Core, but using that as a way in to build up from the basic skills to get kids to be able to do the stuff that's at grade level. If there are kids who are at Algebra 2 or trigonometry, they will do that. I've gone and I've watched the tutors in person, and sometimes at one table kids will be working on adding fractions, and then another table kids will be doing cotangents and secants, and I couldn't even remember what those were, and I have a PhD in economics, so yeah, it varies. I mean, that's one of the nice things about this. It's like it has a lot of the features of tracking, the individualization of tracking, without the downside of tracking, which is that if you have a tracking system, it's very hard to switch tracks. Yep. This is very flexible, so kids can, in the same room, you can, even at the same table, you can have one kid be doing Algebra 2 and another kid learning what exponents are.
And that would be my final comment, which I thought was really nice about the paper, was tying it to the design of schools, that the variation that teachers confront is extraordinary and very rarely acknowledged. So actually thinking through an intervention that builds a little bit on what Tom was saying, a real intervention in real time that enables a young person to be successful in class and assists the teacher in dealing with that variation, I think is really critical when we conceptualize all sorts of different changes.
Can I say one thing along those lines? So one of the other things that we found, which I thought was fascinating, and also I'll just actually take a step back. When I go and I observe this in practice, the first thing I'm always struck by is you walk into the room where the tutorials are happening, and it's really quiet. And if you walk into another math classroom in the high schools that they're working in, it's not always quiet, let's just say. So it's silent, and then you look around, and for a 50-minute period, the kids are doing math for 40 minutes. And so, in some ways you said this is not a new idea. Basically, one way to think about it is if you do math for 40 minutes a day, every day for an entire year, you get better at it. And so the question is, how do you get kids to do math for 40 minutes a day, every day for an entire year? Part of it is that the tutors are sitting across the table from them. It's the same person, and they, work with them, and they don't give up on them, and they, Part of it is that these are kids who have been given math problems that they couldn't do for 5 or 6 years straight, and now someone's giving them math problems that they can do, and they realize, oh, actually, it's actually kind of satisfying. I can do math. I'm not somebody who can't do math. I can, and it actually feels good to do math. And when you have that feeling, you realize, oh, I actually want to do more of it, and then you get better at it. And I think that's part of we have some evidence that you sort of see this mindset change about them, their view about the relationship between studying and the results. And that's, I think, part of the reason why you see effects not just on math, but also on the other subjects.
I've seen that in other tutoring as well.
Yeah.
I want to pull us back a little bit to EduStar and direct a question at Jim, which also, Ben, feel free to join the conversation. Jim, in your book, you're a big proponent of using experimentation to determine what's effective. And it's that experimentation and trial and error is particularly hard in all social policy, and especially in education. I want you to talk a little bit about that difficulty and how we can best use experimentation. And also, thinking about the other panels, people talked a lot about initiative fatigue and how we have experimentation that doesn't create additional initiative fatigue.
Well, let's see. I read the paper and enjoyed it and thought it was an incredibly positive, system. I think that for how you can use it productively in this environment, I guess there are probably 3 simple comments. The first is I think the principles that are laid out are excellent. Certainly the experience in business experimentation is that what we would call moonshot experiments. So analogized in education would be something like, we're going to run the RCT, which will determine once and for all does classroom size matter, right? Are actually less effective in business experimentation than these tiny little tactical changes. On the app, do you want to do 4 times tables and test and 5 times tables and test, or do 4 times tables and 5 times tables and then test? And that the goal really is to build technology and business process to radically lower the cost per experiment so that you're doing thousands, literally. And it's something the size of, say, roughly speaking, a large Chicago school district, LA Unified School District, you're talking about like 1,000 experiments a year, right? And the goal is you get a little bit advantage here, and you get a little advantage there, and a little advantage there, and the expression is you build a mountain of pebbles. And in total, you can build advantage. So I would say that that's one way to help make it practical. A second is a couple things I would probably think about in terms of the EduStar approach is, one, online experimentation, like on websites, has really gotten pretty sophisticated. And there are the technology to design, interpret, and action in-market randomized experiments has gotten good. And it's advancing pretty rapidly. I mean, in 6-month increments, you'll see significant movement in state of the art. So a lot of the kind of next step, here, we want to take the software to be able to do this and this and this, you can go get commercial software. So I would think about importing software technically rather than, the expression is you get on the capability escalator, which will generally crush, a handful of guys doing a homebrew solution. The second kind of suggestion I would think about is, one of the things I haven't heard talked about a lot, and I may be wrong, but I don't think it was mentioned in the paper, is replication. So I would think about, at least consider adding a principle, which is reliability requires replication. That's not only because you want to avoid the whole mess that like social psychology is in, which is you have all kinds of problems with internal validity of studies. Automation can deal with that. But actually, the great weakness of using experiments to change policy decisions in a business or anywhere else is the problem of external validity. So in practical terms, I do this test and I find, it's better to do, the 4 times is in test and the 5 times is in test than the reverse. And in reality, of course, I build some kind of a gross response surface. Like if you have red hair and you're born on Tuesday and you're doing this in the morning on a weekday, you want alternative A. And if you have, no hair and brown eyes and you're born on a Thursday and you're doing it you're executing the program on a Saturday afternoon, you want to do the reverse. That response surface itself changes over time, right? So you did the experiment in April and you proved that out. It's now October 19th and you're using it to take an action, but it turns out that the whole population of students has changed on you, right? Some people aged out, some people aren't there, new students joined. It's not clear that the causal relationship you found holds. In fact, it usually changes. And in fact, it unfortunately almost always changes in a pernicious direction, which is it goes away. So the expression in business experimentation is ice cream melts. As soon as you find some tasty, causal insight that you can use for decision advantage, including the ones we just saw, it might take days, it might take months, it might take years, but you need to keep replicating to test how that's going on. So I'd add replication. I guess the third thing I'd say is, if you think about the experience that the way rapid randomized trials work varies by distribution channel, right? So in a direct distribution channel like we just saw, like webs, right? You've got the education authority, you've just got some software and a screen, and then you've got the user on the other side, right? That's a direct channel. And you have it's the most benign possible environment to run these experiments. It's, first of all, you can get large sample sizes cheaply, and second, you don't have human beings in the loop to execute the program. And a good rule of thumb in experiments is humans suck, right? So indirect channels or institutional channels here would be like, I have the education authority, then I've got a district superintendent, and I've got buildings and classrooms and teachers and all kinds of stuff. And in that environment, it is much harder to run experiments, but actually it's where 99.9% of the weight of resources are. So the third thing I'd say to make it practical is figuring out how to take those principles and apply them into institutional settings.
Maybe I'll let you respond.
Well, that's
to
a
these.
great set of insights and advice, and we certainly don't want our ice cream to melt. So I think, to pick up on just one element of what you're saying, which is external validity. One way to put that is, let's say you do an experiment, and you do it in one school system with one set of kids who are at a certain level of proficiency, and it works really well. Does that generalize to other students, other times of year, to your observation? But students who are more or less proficient at that skill already, et cetera. And so, you can get at that by running the experiments again, but also having a very large user base, right? So students across many school districts coming from very different backgrounds. One piece we have built in is because we have a pre-exercise, we see the kids who are already doing very well at a task before they even get this tool versus those who are don't get everything wrong or somewhere in the middle. And so we can begin to detect whether a given piece of software, say, works on average well, or does it really work for the kids who are really far behind, or the kids who are far behind get nothing out of it, but the ones in the middle really get a big gain. And that gets not only to external validity, which is what generalizes, but it also can get to personalized learning, of course, because the answer may not be, this is the best program for dividing fractions. It may be that this is the right tool for dividing fractions, or the right video, et cetera, for the kid who really has no idea what they're doing. But this tool over here is the one for the kid who's kind of mostly getting it right already, but needs to improve. All of that, I think, is replication, testing across different student populations, looking for these, what I would call heterogeneous treatment effects, personalized learning based on the status of the student at the time. All that is facilitated by scale. So one of our big challenges now going forward, we sort of have a pilot and a proof of concept, and we've got some really nice tools developing that Power My Learning has developed. And the next question is, how do we extend the user community over time so that we can do these things and get at that kind of evidence?
Russ, I want to ask you a question. You've had lots and lots of experience looking at these kind of analysis and experiments in education, and maybe going from this very micro to something we're working on prospectively to looking back historically. Can you talk a little bit about what have been some of the successes and what have been some of the challenges in experimentation like this that's been done?
Let me say first that when I came into the U.S. Department of Education in 2001 to head the research office, we could find the history of one randomized trial that had been sponsored by the department and one that was ongoing. The funding stream to university researchers funded no randomized trials at all. And so here we are 15 years later, and I'm on a panel where people are talking about the best way to do randomized trials. That's progress. I think there are a number of challenges here. I'm very excited about the work, both substantively and in terms of an evidence agenda. And one of the factors that I think shouldn't be lost here, or one that concerns me a lot, is what is the motivation for the learning that comes from using these tools? I think there's an assumption, I brought it with me to my research career, that if you find out something that works, they will come. I don't think that's true now in hindsight. We have a system, the education system, that doesn't really have, if it has a clear bottom line, it's understood differently by different people. And so why should I be concerned that the kids who get tutored do better? And who is concerned about that? And who wants to invest in the next experiment that will make that better? I think that's a smaller population than we think. And I'm not sure what the answer is to contingencies. I mean, No Child Left Behind was an attempt to ram them down from the top and make them totally test score based at the building level. I think there are clearly deficiencies to that. But I don't know that turning control back to local school districts and states and saying, go at it, you'll do a lot better than you did the last time we gave you the reins to control is going to work either. So what is it that motivates people to want to find out which software product works best, to go look at a resource to pick the best one and move forward? I'm not sure unless we have ways that make individual teachers and individual principals care about those results and getting better. So we need metrics, we need accountability. I think we need to think about that hard. Also, there's an interesting contrast here between these two presentations. One was really quite micro and in a sense close to the kind of work that Jim Manzi's company did in terms of business analytics and A/B comparisons. You know, it's like Google deciding, so how big should the ad be on the side? And let's try it two different ways very quickly, and we'll find out. That is suitable to certain types of software design issues. The other study we saw is one that took a couple of years to put in place and will be most powerful when we find out high school graduation and college going rates. That's a very different type of enterprise. We need to honor both of those and support them because both of them are important to solving the puzzle going forward. And I think finally on the micro side, on
EduStar.
EduStar, I thought I had that right. And I think the powerful use of the kind of quick turnaround A/B trial for software is not necessarily going into a school district and convincing it to try software A versus software B. It's to embed that capability in the product itself so that the product is constantly improving itself. You don't need the permission of the district to improve your product. It's just part of the design design feature of the product. And so it's whether, version 2 of product A works better than version 1.8 of product A. And to do that constantly for software, for educational software, well, I think will get us where we need to be much quicker than the kind of product brand A versus brand B comparison. If you want to see the government's effort to do that, go to the What Works Clearinghouse. We're all full of brand name data. And I think that's valuable, but it's not ultimately valuable if the job is to make it better.
Russ, I have one follow-up question that came from the audience about the clearinghouse. Has that clearinghouse made a difference? What would make it more useful? And then I was also, I know on the previous panel, in discussing Title I and discussing what information needs to be disseminated, Carol spoke about the fact that it's not just how the money can be used, but urging people for better dissemination of the research that's out there. And I wondered, again, if it's a lack of information, like with Title I funding.
Well, yes, I think the clearinghouse has been valuable. If it's done nothing else, it's established a very clear set of rules for what constitutes rigor in research. And people look at that, they're worried that if they're a researcher and do a study, it won't be approved by the clearinghouse. In its early years, it was called the Nothing Works Clearinghouse because there's a lot of research there and nothing worked. And I think that's not true anymore. There are over 100 studies there that show positive impact with well-designed trials. I think what could make it more useful is first having a motive for people to care what's in the clearinghouse. And we don't have that. And then I think the issues that Jim Manzi has talked so eloquently about are critical. We can't be proud of having funded 300 randomized trials over 5 years. We need 10,000 trials in a year to take advantage of the fact that it is fundamentally trial and error the error rate is going to be 90 or 95%. If we don't have a lot of it, the yield is not going to be sufficient to move us forward.
So one thing that's come up a couple times was sort of how the research gets disseminated and how people learn about the results of the research. And also you asked a question earlier about, I think you called it intervention fatigue.
Yeah.
So, one of the ways that we at the Urban Education Lab have sort of dealt with both of those issues is that we think of the Chicago Public Schools and the other school districts that we work with as our partners. And so we don't go to them and say, here's something that we think would really work, can we just test it? Or here's something that we think we can get published in the American Economic Review, can we test it? We work with them to figure out what problems they want to know the answers to. And then we find overlap of things where we think we can help them find the answers and that we're interested in ourselves, and the things they want to know the answers to. And so then in doing that, we develop the study together with them. That means the implementation, I think, works a lot better. But it also means that when we find the answer, they want to know. And so we already have one very big school district who wants to know the answer, and then once they find the answer, other school districts want to know as well. Another thing was, I had heard this thing about the Nothing Works clearinghouse. It's actually quite useful to know what doesn't work.
Sure it is.
A school district that has very limited budget, it's actually more useful to know that some of the things they're spending money on is not very effective. That frees up the budget constraint. You can try other things. And then the last thing is, there's this perception that randomized control trials of the sort that I'm talking about are really expensive. And it is true that there are big budgets to fund randomized control trials, but a lot of times that's because the budgets are funding the intervention itself or data collection to try and measure the outcomes to see whether the thing worked. And we're able to do a lot of the work that we're doing in Chicago and New York City and some other places at lower cost because those places themselves have really good data systems where they've collected administrative data. And so we don't have to raise money in Chicago to be able to measure the outcomes that we look at. They already have collected that data. And so, the randomized part of the randomized control trial is free. It doesn't cost anything. I'll do it for anybody. I'll randomize whatever you want to do. I'll donate my time. The randomization is free. It's the other stuff around it, which we would have to pay for anyway, to do a study or even just to do the intervention that costs all the money. So, I think the work that you did, Russ, to encourage the RCTs in education is incredibly important, and I think we should do more of it. But I think sometimes people get scared off of it because A, they say it's going to take a long time, and B, it's really expensive. The long time thing, again, partially, because we have this ongoing relationship with Chicago, we're sort of, it took a while to get our first set of results, but now we always have new results coming out, and we're also always starting on something else, replicating the old one or starting something new. So there's this stream of information that comes out that can be sustainable, and you don't have to think of every study as something that you're investing in and you're not going to find out the results for 2 years.
Could I just, a quick follow-up? I mean, the administrative data is critically important here because nearly all the costs are connected with collecting outcome data. And the federal government has now invested $500 million in, I think, 46 states to fund statewide longitudinal data systems that have microdata on individual kids, every public school in the state. Most large districts have data warehouses. It's still extraordinarily difficult to get into any of that data unless you have a personal relationship with a state official who can unlock the key. And that's a federal policy issue, at least at the statewide level. Federal government paid for it. One of the requirements in the legislation was that it be available for research. We need to unlock those safes and let people in. It's just not the partnerships that we need, though they're extraordinarily valuable. It's the people from outside who have some serious critical question about what a district is doing and should be able to independently get at the data and say, well, you've been telling us this works, and it doesn't. That's a very important part of what we need to do going forward.
Let me just add to build and echo on these comments. This is what I've come to call operational RCTs. And I think the key is, and this applies to education or any really organization, the government itself, any business, the trick is, if you're going to deliver a service anyway, can you build evaluation into it in a rigorous way? So in our case with EduStar, these kids are going to be in front of a computer anyway. They're going to spend time and they're going to be given some digital tool. So is there a way to, in the course of that instruction, to learn something about how to do that? And I think, all of these cases can have those features, because if you do it that way, you lower the cost, as we're saying, about doing the RCT. But the other thing is, by lowering the cost, of course, that's when you get to do a lot of these things, right? And so, the education landscape is very complicated. It's big. There's lots of features on it. But we're delivering programming all the time. And how can we deliver that programming in any way, on any dimension, where we're actually learning something and not just delivering? And I think if we can get that philosophy, and of course, the internet and administrative data and database systems are facilitating our capacity to do that in ways that we didn't have before. And I think, if the What Works Clearinghouse in 2001 was sort of a bold idea that RCTs matter, if we can hitch on to the technological developments that are happening in schools and elsewhere to think about a philosophy of delivering but learning at the same time, I think our chance for improvement and the rate of improvement, just go up dramatically.
I would just add one thing, which is I do think it's important to choose problems. Yes, we need independent evaluation, but also to choose problems that focus on the day-to-day of practitioners themselves. So I want to just echo that notion that in the macro world, there is a hidden complexity to schools, and you can choose programs or ideas that aren't going to necessarily matter to teachers and principals. When you stop and think about a school of 400 students, there are 30,000 lessons delivered in that school at any point, 9,000 administrations of the regents in New York City on an annual basis, about 4,708 credits to track, 300 individual courses and titles, 250 teacher teams, and 200 teacher observations. That is the day-to-day life of a practitioner in a 400-student New York City public school. So I think we have to actually start to understand the real conditions in schools and then craft these types of RCTs that deal with the big problems first before we get to kind of micro problems, because I think we will build an audience for that if we get some quick wins with practitioners early.
This is a question, Russ, you brought up longitudinal studies, but it's really a question for anyone on the panel. In addition to the enormous complexity that happens each day, you also have each child from kindergarten to 12th grade. These two interventions that we saw were really focused, especially Jonathan, especially the tutorial, was focused on kids in high school, and with this theory that it's not too late. And I wondered if, and we have right now so much focus on universal pre-K, I wonder if whoever would like to volunteer to speak a little bit about interventions at different ages.
We actually don't know much, I think, about, they're very strong assumptions that, the dosage effect is going to be much larger the younger you start. It's not an unreasonable assumption. We're full of all sorts of metaphors about that. As the twig is bent, so grows the tree, and things like that. But the empirical basis for that is really quite weak. And the challenge, I think, should be to meet kids where they are, as both of these interventions are trying to do, and not write them off because they didn't get universal pre-K, which, by the way, no president of the United States has ever had. So there are opportunities at all points in the lifespan to intervene. And I think one of the lessons here, particularly from the tutoring, is that the idea that it's too late is fundamentally wrong. And a lot can be done. The brain doesn't stop growing until you're dead. And there's plenty of opportunity to affect kids and students and families for the better where you find them with the needs they have.
Jonathan, I know you want to respond. And in addition to your response, if you can give us a little thumbnail sketch. I have a lot of questions, a whole fistful, about the tutors, their training, how they're selected, how you can scale up.
Okay, so let me just say quickly, I want to just echo what Russ said, which is that when I give the longer version of my presentation, I start off with this idea that there are these big achievement gaps that have persisted for a long time in education, and we haven't made very much progress over a long period of time, and that has led lots of people to wonder whether why those achievement gaps exist. And if you sort of think about it long enough, you come back to poverty, and then you start to think, well, the effects of poverty are long-lasting, and growing up in neighborhoods, the violence and deprivation, et cetera, over a long period of time leads to outcomes like high school dropout, involvement in crime, et cetera, et cetera. And that if you start thinking about that as somebody who's interested in policy, you start to think, well, okay, so in order to narrow achievement gaps, I now have to rid the world of poverty. And that is a really depressing thought as a professor who studies policy. Not because I don't want to rid the world of poverty. I would love to do that, but if that's a necessary condition, then we're in a big trouble. And I think that is some of the type of thinking that has led to this idea that we have to intervene early. And I'm all for early intervention. I do research myself on the long-term effects of early life conditions. But I think that type of thinking has led in the policy world to this belief that if we don't intervene early, that by the time kids become adolescents, it's too late to do anything. And I think that that's too pessimistic, and I think it's wrong. I think our paper, we think of it as a demonstration of that being wrong, that we just have been aiming at the wrong targets. It's not that it's impossible to intervene effectively once kids become adolescents. It's just that the things that we have tried and studied just haven't happened to be the right solution. So I'll leave it there. As far as the tutors, so many of the tutors are recent college graduates from good selective universities who want to spend a year or two doing service. They are interested in potentially going into the classroom, maybe, but not sure that they want to be a classroom teacher right away. So think of somebody who is contemplating doing Teach for America, but the idea of being a classroom teacher at that stage of their life without any experience is daunting. Some of them are older career switchers. Some of them come from other situations. There's a wide variety of.
Jonathan, a lot of questions about whether people were bilingual,
Yeah.
whether that was necessary, whether it was place for peer tutoring.
Yeah. So in Chicago, the schools that we're in, there's a mix. So most of the students in the schools that we're serving, most of the students in the program are African American and Hispanic. And so in the schools where there are more Hispanic students, there are more of the tutors are bilingual. But there's a mix of, in terms of racial and ethnic background of the students, of the tutors. The tutors, there's a rigorous selection process that Saga does to both recruit and then select the tutors. So they all have to take a math test and pass a math test. They all come in and do tutorials with the students in the schools and are observed doing the tutorials by the administrators of Saga, but also by the current tutors to see whether they think they would be someone who could do this job well. One of the things that Saga talks a lot about when they're selecting the tutors is it's important that the tutors are someone who believes that everyone can succeed, and that because a big part of the job is to, the kids come in and, if you think of somebody who's at a 4th grade level or 5th grade level of math, and you start throwing math problems in front of them, many of them have this mindset that they're just like, I'm not good at math. And so you have to break through that. And so being persistent and believing that you can do this, just stick with me, that's very important. Anything?
Russ, we have one question here, which I know you've expressed it already, but I have to read it. Can we more effectively get the fragmented U.S. education system to pay attention to evidence?
I think we can, but again, it goes to the motive to pay attention to evidence. I mean, I have a pet policy prescription here, which sounds probably more conservative than I am, and it's that, and we'll go back to the Title I funding. Imagine rather than a district getting Title I money, which they then can give to 80% of their schools, the Title I funding and the state funding, and with incentive, the local funding, was attached to the child with a weighted formula. And the parent could shop for the school at which they wanted their child to enroll that gets the tuition. We just heard in the previous panel how high schools that previously didn't want poor kids are now saying, could we have 50 more? I think to the extent that we could encourage parents to pay attention to evidence, and I can think of ways to do that, it would drive those who are providing the service to the parents to try to be sensitive to evidence as well. It is at least a theory of action. Give me that.
Managed care of education?
Pardon?
Managed care of education?
Well, it would certainly be managed. It would be managed. That is, the state, and to take it as a serious question, the state and the district would certainly be responsible for setting a lower bar. You don't want people to be able to shop. You don't want people to be able to eat in restaurants that give them ptomaine poisoning. You don't want them to send their schools to kids that damage them educationally. And somebody needs to be involved, as they are in New Orleans, in assuring that there's a good supply, that you encourage people into the market, and that you shut down poor providers. And certainly somebody's got to provide the shopping information. I can go on Amazon. If I want to buy a watch band, which I bought last week, there are thousands. There's information about them. If I want to shop for a school for my kid, I'm in the dark. So there are roles there, and it's not quite managed care, but it is managed. It's not free and open Wild West competition.
The last question is for Jonathan. We have a lot of questions about the scalability of your, and I know it's in the proposal, but not everyone has had time to read it. Maybe you can briefly discuss that.
Yeah, so this is the thing that we're currently studying, actually. And we've proposed scaling it up to a fairly massive scale. I think one way to think about it is that Saga has worked very hard to sort of distill down what the components are to the program, so that if you go into a Saga tutorial room in any different one of the schools that we go to, when I walk in, it looks exactly the same. There's a standardization of what happens, not just in a classroom, but minute by minute. Okay, so there's a recipe, and I think that makes it something that is potentially more easily scalable than other programs. The other way to think about it is that as they scale, or as other nonprofits that were well run would try to scale a similar model, there are inputs that they would have to get lots of, and the main one would be the tutors. So that one way to think about is how scalable this is a question about how easy would it be to get the 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 tutors you'd need every year to do it on the scale that we're proposing. And to be honest, we haven't tested it at that scale, so we don't really know. We're developing methods to try and learn about how things would work at very large scales without having to do it. But a couple pieces of evidence. One is that when Saga tries to hire at the scale that they're hiring, they get far more applications of qualified people than they hire. So they're turning people away. So they could scale up, certainly relative to the scale that they're at. And the other is that, and I think this is one of the insights, you sort of said earlier that tutoring is not a new idea. That's certainly true. I mean, tutoring's been around since, for a very, very long time.
Plato.
But one of the insights, I think, is that the job of a tutor is very different and much more simple than the job of being a teacher. And so what that means is there are far more people who could be an effective tutor right now than who could be an effective classroom teacher right now. And turnover is not such a big problem because the tutors become fairly effective very soon. It doesn't take the 3 years it takes to become an effective classroom teacher. You can do it for a year and be effective the first year. We tested it. We did the randomized controlled trial with tutors who was their first year of tutoring, and they were incredibly effective. So that just means that there's, you don't need a pipeline, a whole system of educational, ed schools to train tutors. You just need people who are willing to take 1 year to do something like AmeriCorps or City Year or Teach for America and do this, and there are probably a lot more people who could do this and be effective than at something like Teach for America.
Well, I want to also here to close the afternoon out. I want to thank all of our authors. The papers are available outside together with 14 economic facts on education. Many are very sobering. There were a few points of light within those 14 facts. I want to thank our panelists also from all 3 panels, the folks at Hamilton, and most especially our audience for joining us. Thank you.